Hi, this is Danielle Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at Beth Avraham Yosef of Toronto, the Bayit, and we are studying Moreh Nevukhim, and we're on the webyeshiva.org platform, which is a wonderful platform of Torah, shiurim, classes, information that we're glad that you're a part of. We are studying chapter 21 in the second section of Moreh Nevukhim. Um, uh, Last week, in chapter 20, the Rambam had devoted himself to citing what he felt was somewhat of a contradiction in Aristotle, because Aristotle, in his physics, had talked about how all of existence uh, is here by non-chance, not by chance. Aristotle has a discussion about what randomness means and how, by and large, all of existence, both in the heavens and the sublunary realm, in our realm, you don't find a lot of randomness. You find that there's a sense of continuity of the laws of physics without things changing dramatically from time to time. Um, the Rambam felt that Aristotle may have somewhat contradicted himself by also suggesting that there seems to be a sentience and will that brings about the all of existence from what Aristotle calls the prime mover, the prime force, meaning the ultimate deity that is responsible for all of existence. Because after all, will or volition or whatever you're going to call kavanah, purpose, depends how you translate that word, implies that God could have as easily not created as created, or could have as easily created something completely different. And the term non-chance seems to suggest that it needed to emanate the way that it did from the prime being. And so the Aristotle had suggested that this seems to be somewhat of a contradiction in Aristotle. Now, chapter 21 is almost identical. But there's one additional facet in chapter 21 that does not exist in chapter 20. And that is the Rambam says, I'm now going to quote to you from later Aristotelian philosophers, meaning of the medieval world, that the Rambam is very familiar with because they're part of the Islamic milieu in which the Rambam learned Aristotelian philosophy in the first place. What I mean is that in the medieval period, there were great Islamic philosophers who took up the mantle of Aristotle and refined and clarified and explained a lot of Aristotelian writings and brought those writings to the Arabic world. Um, uh, what it would seem then that even though this chapter is almost identical, what the Rambam is doing is that he's specifically polemicizing against the conventional wisdom of his own day instead of just taking issue with the ancient Aristotelian writings. And we find this in many places where the Rambam seems to repeat himself. I would suggest this seems to be what I'm inferring from times where the Rambam seems to repeat himself from one chapter to another. There are times when he has to take issue or present some kind of critique of the original Aristotelian writing, and then later on he may actually take a similar tactic of critique but this time presented directly against the contemporary writings of his era. And so we are on page 314 in the Shlomo Pines edition, and we do have a handout today to help clarify what we're discussing. You can download it from webyeshiva.org's course description for today's course, or you can get it from Facebook on the Facebook group or the Facebook community called Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. And we'll post that on the screen so that you have a chance to see it on your screen for those who are watching the video. And we call this chapter um, Existence by Necessity and Existence by Will are Incompatible. And you notice that there's a slight change in terminology from the way that the Rambam was speaking in chapter 20, specifically, I believe, because he's dealing with a slightly different terminology between Aristotle and the philosophers of his time. And specifically, he's most likely referring to Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who was a great collector and explainer, expositor on the writings of Aristotle. Now, to give you an idea that this is what's going on, I wanted to share with you a short passage from a work that the Rambam was quite familiar with. There was a philosopher by the name of AlGhazali, and he lived until the very beginning of the 12th century. So his life and the Rambam's life did not overlap. AlGhazali dies about 20, over a little bit over 20 years before the Rambam is born. His most famous work is known as The Incoherence of the Philosophers, in which he undertakes a defense of traditional Islamic theology in the face of the Aristotelian Muslim philosophers of his time, who professed to be devoutly Islamic and religious, but at the same time espoused Aristotelian philosophy, which Al-Ghazali felt was completely incompatible with the Islamic faith. And therefore, he wrote a book polemicizing against all of the philosophers who had preceded him within the Arabic world, and he proceeded to show that they don't make any sense. And that's why it's called the incoherence of the philosophers. Now, there's a lot to be said about Al-Ghazali that today is not really the time to do so, but his work is probably most responsible for Islam taking a very sharp right turn and turning its back on the philosophical world in general and becoming more fundamentalist uh, and uh, and focused really on theological issues instead of philosophical issues for several centuries after this period of this golden age of where Islam was steeped in Greek philosophy. Um, so that's why the Rambam begins his chapter with know that among the latter day philosophers who affirm the eternity of the world. So he's now shifting gears on page 314 from Aristotle himself in the Book of Physics, Book 2, to latter day philosophers, to sort of give you a forspice of how the Rambam's argumentation is going to proceed. Let's take a look at a passage from Al-Ghazali. This is a translation that was done in 1963 by the Pakistan Philosophical Congress on page 64. And it's Takhafut al-Falasifa is the Arabic term for the incoherence of the philosophers. And he says as follows: we say an agent, the word agent in Hebrew would be a poel, someone who acts upon to produce some existent being, is he from whom an action proceeds because of the will, or what we would call ratzon in Hebrew, for action, by way of free choice, that being who acts volitionally has free will. That means has bechira from in Hebrew, and alongside of the knowledge of what is willed, um, and is completely sentient. But in your view, meaning you is Aristotelian Avicenna, who do not agree with this, has a different view, the world bears the same reflection to God as an effect to its cause, which means that the way the world exists today is not a result of a volitional free will decision to make it specifically this way and not another way or not at all, but rather it necessarily, and that's the word necessity, is going to be recurring in this chapter. You, Avicenna, maintain that the universe as we know it, all of existence, necessarily emanates and is a product of this prime cause. So it follows from him by way of necessary causation. And this is the main difference between you and me. And therefore, it is not conceivable that God should have been able to avoid his action, even as the shadow is unavoidable to a person or light to the sun. Sun, by its very nature, emanates light. You cannot suggest to the sun to not shine. The sun, by its very definition, necessarily shines because it is a ball of energy that necessarily emits light. To suggest that God could have not created or could have not emanated, I should say is the more correct term, all of existence, or to suggest that the sun is tantamount to suggesting that the sun could choose to not emit its light. And that's an impossibility. That's an absurdity. Now, this has nothing to do with an action, which in Hebrew we would call a pe'ula, which is implies that there was a choice involved. He who says that the lamp does the light, or that a person does the shadow, will be extending the sense of the word beyond its definition. And now this is a very important point that it would seem to me that the additional facet that the Rambam is adding in chapter 21 above and beyond chapter 20 is not only to engage with modern philosophers of his time, but also to add this facet that I believe he may have culled or seen in his reading of AlGhazali, which is you're playing with words. You're using semantics to try and twist things to fit when these words do not lend themselves to the way that you're using them. You are suggesting that something that necessarily emits from God was emitted by God's will or God's pu'ula, which implies a volition, a choice. And that is simply wordplay, that you're taking the words will or desire, and God wants this to emit from him when it necessarily happens not based on a sentience of happiness and will, and therefore you're combining two systems that are not compatible. You will be borrowing a word used in a different context, having been too easily contended with the relation between the two things in respect of only one attribute, namely that an agent, a poel, is on the whole a cause, and the lamp is the cause of illumination, and the sun is the cause of light. But the agent is not called the agent merely because of its being a cause, but because it is a cause in a special manner, specifically in the matter of will and free choice. Thus, it is that when one says that the wall is not an agent, the stone is not an agent, the inorganic matter is not an agent, for an action exclusively belongs to an animal, a being of sentience and will, then this statement will not be disputed and his words will not be untrue. By an animal, he means a living creature, and his words will not be untrue. But in their view, the stone does have an action, meaning a willful choice to act, namely the inclination or the gravitation or the tending towards the center, meaning behaving according to its nature. And so does fire have an action, specifically producing heat. And they believe that that which proceeds from God is like all these things, but this is absurd. So this is all a quote from the Islamic philosopher AlGhazali, late 11th century, early 12th century. Now let's take a look at the Rambam, late 12th century, writing in Moreh Nevukhim. He says, know that among the latter day, now we're back in the text on page 314. Among the latter day philosophers who affirm the eternity of the world, there are some who maintain that God, may be exalted, is the agent of the world, meaning the same word that AlGhazali uses is the poel, who chose that it should exist, purposed it, and particularized it. We had that idea of particularization in the last few chapters, meaning God decided to make it one specific way when it could have been it could have been made in many different other kinds of ways. It is so that it should be as it actually is. They think, however, that it is impossible that this should have happened at one particular time rather than at another. According to them, the world has always been and will always be like this. So we're going to go to our outline now to really see where the Rambam is going. Later philosophers, presumably Avicenna, have tried to reconcile the Aristotelian argument for an eternal universe with a teleological existence created by God who wills and particularizes. We saw that term teleology in chapter 20, meaning that it is there is a sentience that wills things to exist as they do. Now, how do we reconcile the apparent need for creation for a theological God? Because if God is a willful being, a volitional being, it would seem that he brings things into existence at will, which means that there's a creation. So, and yet, Avicenna and other philosophers who follow Aristotle believe in the eternality of the universe, that things have always been the way they are. And if things have always been the way they are, then that implies a certain necessity. They always have had to be this way. Otherwise, it could have been created at one time over another. But no, it's always been this way because it always had to be. It was necessary to be this way. So, how do we reconcile this? If you believe in an eternal universe, how do you reconcile this with a God of will, who wills things to be, desires things to be the way they are? So the Rambam's response to that, and this is on the bottom of 314, top of page 315, that this is only a dilemma for humans who think in human terms. Every being who is an agent, that is, who produces, is in a state of privation and potentiality before the product is produced. We associate a human being who is an agent. So a human being who's a carpenter and wishes to create a chair. Before he brings the chair into reality, he is only a potential agent. And then once he brings the chair into existence, he is now an active agent of that chair. We've seen this terminology before in Aristotle. This privation is what impels the agent to produce. In other words, why did the carpenter make the chair? Because he needed a chair, or because he needed the income that he would garner from selling the chair. So he was lacking something which impelled him and incentivized him to bring the chair into existence, to produce the chair. But once that agent has produced, the agent is a producer in actuality. And this, of course, is a depiction of the human concept of what an agent does. An agent is in a state of privation, of not having something or not being fulfilled in some way. This spurs the agent to produce something which will make the agent feel a sense of wholeness or being actual in his state of being a producer or an agent, and then everything is good. But God is completely different from humans in this regard because God's relation to his product is completely different from our relation to our product. And to just quote directly from the Rambam, the same is true with regard to particularization and will. These philosophers basically say the way that we would reconcile the idea that the world has eternally and necessarily existed with the idea that God chooses to particularize the universe in a specific way, and he does so volitionally, the reason why this seems to be an apparent contradiction is because we're thinking about it in human terms. But once we think about it in divine terms, God necessarily emanates, and therefore everything has always existed. And at the same time, God desires for things to be the way they are and chooses to particularize or make things specifically this way and not another way. It is also impossible that an act of his will should change. That his act or his will should change. Again, a direct quote from the Rambam on page 315, which is the reason why Avicenna and other modern Islamic philosophers subscribe to the Aristotelian idea that the world has always existed. Ergo, since we cannot understand God properly, we also cannot understand how God emanates necessarily on the one hand, but also wills and particularizes on the other hand. The Rambam's response to this, and this is on the paragraph starting on page 315, it has already become clear to you who are engaged in the study of this, my treatise, that these people have altered the term necessity. Okay, so you're already seeing that the Rambam is going along the same path as AlGhazali, that he's picking apart, he's critiquing these modern philosophers based on the fact that they are manipulating language inappropriately. So, but have let its meaning remain. And perhaps they intended to choose a more beautiful expression or to get rid of one that is shocking. In other words, they're trying to use a word that would shock the sensibilities of a person who is a theological subscriber to Torah by changing its meaning, but they can't do so. It's just not going to work. For the meaning of the assertion is maintained by Aristotle that this being proceeds necessarily from its cause and is perpetual in virtue of the latter's perpetuity, that cause being the deity, is identical with the meaning of their assertion that the world derives from the act of the deity or the agency of the deity, or exists in virtue of his purpose, will, free choice, and particularization, but that it has always been and will always be as it is, just as the sunrise is undoubtedly the agent of the day, though neither of them precedes the other in point of time. But that is not the meaning of purpose as we propose to conceive it. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And as we go along in this outline, number two, this is wordplay since you cannot have it both ways. They wish to assert that the Aristotelian concept of existence emerging necessarily from God is consistent with God possessing agency, purpose, will, free choice, and particularization. The terms being that they wish to say that on the one hand, everything necessarily emanates from God, but nonetheless, God is a poel, is a machavein, is a rotzeh, is a bocher, and is a miyached. This is patently false, since purpose means that God's products do not necessarily emanate from him, certainly not in the same way that an effect proceeds from its cause, like daytime proceeding from sunrise. You cannot separate daytime from sunrise. As soon as the sun comes out, it is automatically now daytime. If something works automatically and necessarily as a cause and effect, then you cannot say that that action was a product of or was what the reason for this cause and effect was because of some volition or will. Similarly, to suggest God's agency and particularization contradicts emanation by necessity. Now, to be clear, and this is where the Rambam, we turn the page, and the Rambam, we're now on page 316, Aristotle's definition of necessary causality from God is not a causality based in time. Aristotle does not believe that the world emanated from God at one given time, that God pre-existed the world, and then the world afterwards came into being. That's not what he means when he says that the prime cause or God is the cause of the world. When he says that A causes B, and as we know, Aristotle has a chain of causalities going from the highest cause, the prime cause, down to the highest sphere, down through all of the spheres and their respective intelligences until we get down to the reality of our world. But he doesn't mean that A preceded B chronologically, but rather that A is the cause of B's existence. And by analogy, and the Rambam cites this, in the paragraph on page 316, if someone said that roughness, smoothness, hardness, softness, thickness, and absorbency necessarily derive from the first qualities of heat, cold, humidity, and dryness. Now, what he means by this is that in Aristotelian science, there are primary qualities that describe the attributes of any object that exists in our world. And then there are things that are called secondary attributes. So, and all of those secondary attributes emanate from the mixture or lack thereof of these first qualities. There are four first qualities. Something is either hot or cold or moist or humid or dry. And those four qualities, hot and cold is one group, moist and dry is another group. When they are combined in an object, that object will also manifest other attributes which are a product of it being either hot or cold or moist or dry, such as will the surface texture of the object be rough or will it be smooth? Will the object have a hard surface or will it have a soft surface? If it's perhaps very dry, it'll have a harder surface. If it's moist, it might have a softer surface. Will it have thickness? Will it have absorbency and so forth? Accordingly, these secondary qualities necessarily derive from the first four qualities, even though it is impossible that a body should exist endowed with only the first four qualities and devoid of the secondary ones. It's absurd to suggest that something can be moist and have and not have a soft surface. You must have both. You cannot have one without the other. And therefore, it's we do say that its moistness causes its softness. Let's say the softness of a sponge or something like that. But the uh, but it's not correct to suggest that the the moistness preceded chronologically the softness. They go hand in hand, even though one is the cause of the other. So that's not how you and I normally think about cause, but if you recall, Aristotle had four different causes. And then what we talk about efficient causes, it's not something that's based in time, but rather, why is this thing this way? We say it's this way, oh, because it's moist and therefore it's soft. Not because its moistness preceded its softness. Okay, the chain of causalities that make up all existence necessarily proceeds from that and so forth till the series ends with the first cause. And therefore, and this is an important line in the text, all of us, namely both Aristotelian philosophers and followers of the Torah, whose philosophy is based exclusively on what's written in the Torah, aim at one and the same principle when we say that God is the primary cause of everything that exists. The only difference between us and Aristotle, however, is that Aristotle believes that because God is the prime force, the prime cause of all that exists, everything that exists has eternally existed. We, however, believe in creation, but the idea that God is ultimately the first cause of everything is something that we accept in the Torah as well, and that's why the very first principle in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, which is how the Rambam opens up his Mishnah Torah, are the following words: Yesod HaYesodot, the Amud HaChochmot, the very pillar of all, or the very foundation of all foundations, and the very pillar of all wisdom is Leida Sheyesham Matsui Rishon, is to know that there is a prime existent being, V'hu Mamtzi Kol Nimtza, and he, that prime being, is the cause of all that exists, or is the producer or the agent of all that exists. V'chol hanimtzaim mishamayim va'aretz u'ma shebeinehem, and all that exists in heaven and earth and everything in between, lo nimtzu ela me'amitat himatzao, do only exist because of the trueness or the truthness of his existence. Uh, Essentially, because God is the truest of all existence, in the sense that his existence is not dependent upon or contingent upon anything else, which cannot be said about anything else because everything else that exists is contingent upon God. But at the same time, his main point is that everything is a product or is produced or is caused by the Ribbono Shel Olam. We agree with that as much as Aristotle, and perhaps we even get this terminology from Aristotle. But and this is the last point, Aristotle holds that everything necessarily proceeds from it, this prime cause. We, by contrast, affirm that all these things have been made by him in virtue of purpose and a will directed towards this particular being, which did not exist and now became an existent in virtue of his will. May he be exalted. Just reiterating what we've seen the Rambam discuss again and again over the last few chapters. And therefore, he says, he concludes this by saying the following chapters will argue in favor of creation, that is, existence originating at some point in time. And with this, we conclude chapter 21. Again, as I said, no chidushim, no novelties above and beyond what we already saw in chapter 20. Slightly different terminology because he is polemicizing not against Aristotle directly, but rather against the philosophers of his time, very much in the same way that his predecessor AlGhazali argued the same against Avicenna and his contemporaries. And I hope that you got something from this class today. We will conclude now, and I, take care.